Hello, I'm Yasmin Abdel-Majid, and I'm very excited to be presenting this event, which is part of Selfridges Project Earth initiative, a journey the store has embarked on, which puts sustainability at the heart of its business and which aims to change the way we shop by 2025. The event is co-hosted by Intelligence Squared, the world's leading forum for live debate and discussion. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on what young people today are doing to bring us a cleaner, greener future. We have with us three extraordinary young activists who are all engaged in different ways to bring about change and convey a positive message for the future. First up, we have Zakiya Kadjie, the founder of Swap It Up, a clothing exchange program that runs in schools. She also works with a campaign group called Teach the Future that aims to reorient the entire education system around the climate emergency. And she now works for Mock COP, an international youth-led project mirroring that of COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, and raising global awareness to tackle the climate crisis. We also have Clover Hogan, climate activist and the founder of Force of Nature, a launchpad helping Gen Z translate eco-anxiety into positive action in the face of the climate crisis. She's worked alongside the world's leading authorities on sustainability and consulted in Fortune 500 boardrooms. And thirdly, we have Zemzem Ibrahim, co-founder of Students Organizing for Sustainability, vice chair of the Muslim Leadership Foundation, and the former national president and vice president of the National Union of Students. Zemzem is also working at Green New Deal on the Build Back Better campaign that she'll tell you more about, and she's a leading voice on tackling climate injustice, more specifically in the education system, with the goal of diverting attention away from the Eurocentric lens through which the climate crisis is currently portrayed. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really, really excited to hear from all three of you. For those watching, I'm going to be taking your questions a bit later, but you can start submitting them now in the question box on your screen. I'm going to start by asking each of you to tell us briefly how you became engaged in climate activism. Was it something that came to you gradually, or was there like some aha moment? Zemzem, I'll start with you.
Thank you. So excited to be here with some incredible people that I love and know in very different ways. For me, if I'm honest with you, like I was essentially a environmental skeptic just a couple of years ago. And I think for that reason, and the reason for that is because I think political education isn't something that was afforded to me, and therefore never really understood the impact that the environment essentially is having on me directly, and how that is linked to social justice. And it's only when I started to understand those impacts, and actually, like I think my aha moment actually came from me organizing with when I was the officer at Sulphur Students Union. I was a vice president, and I was organizing the Black Students Campaign in NUS. And there's like an annual conference that we put on, and I got the opportunity to host Asad Rahman, who is an incredible climate justice activist. And he was talking about his journey through the student movement, and he was talking about his journey through like addressing inequalities. And I was like essentially like sat there like doing a Q&A with him, and he like perfectly just summated how like all these like essentially like, the inequalities and discriminations that we will fight against as a part of these different campaigns all fall under like one bracket, like how capitalism is essentially like the root cause of it. And like for me it was like the aha moment of being like, wait, so like racism is linked to environmentalism, and that's when I noticed that like actually like this work is a social justice issue, and like I've been at the forefront of pushing that out, but also like changing and translating the way we speak about it, and the way we translate what environmental justice means, what climate justice means, and actually who it impacts the most. And I've spent the last couple of years just like absolutely just reframing the way in which we see it and the way we talk about it.
I love that. Thank you, Zemzem. Zakiya, what about yourself?
So for me, climate change has always been kind of on my radar since I was quite young. But it wasn't until about 2 years ago when the report came out saying that we had 12 years left until climate change was irreversible, that I was like, right, we need to do something about this now. And then also, me and my friends had discussed it quite a bit. And then suddenly I was just like, okay, I need to do something. And that moment where it changed from something needs to happen to where I need to do something was because I was actually on holiday in Italy at the time. And we saw all of these clothing stalls with pre-loved clothes that you were able to buy things for about €1 each. And I just really enjoyed the experience of being able to buy these clothes. And then I started to make the connections between how you're saving these clothes from going to landfill and how actually the fast fashion industry has such a massive impact on the environment. Previously, I'd been aware of like the social impacts of fast fashion and had tried to steer away from it as much as possible. But then I realized, okay, so it's not just the social aspect, there's also this environmental aspect, which, as we've all been discussing previously, that also has knock-on social consequences as well. And so it was kind of that moment where I was like, right, I need to do something right now in order to secure my future.
You're totally right. I'm feeling the feels. Sorry, Clover, let's come to you.
Sorry, I'll let you have your moment. So I grew up in Australia's tropical North Queensland, fishing frogs out of the toilet and dodging snakes that hung from the ceiling. So for me, nature was never an other. It was always an integral part of my lived experience, and I never doubted that. Until I started watching documentaries at 11. So I watched The Cove, I watched An Inconvenient Truth, and suddenly it was this shock to the system as I realized the thing that got me out of bed in the morning, the thing that I held so dear, was under global threat. And so in that was a lot of despair and a lot of overwhelm and frustration and fear. And yet I also saw that there were people on the front lines of this movement shining light on the problems. And I decided that I wanted to become one. So I declared to my parents that I wanted to commit my life to environmentalism. And they allowed themselves to be coerced into moving to Indonesia so that I could go to a place called the Green School, which is wallless bamboo classrooms in the middle of the jungle. And beyond the compost toilets, what really distinguishes Green School is that instead of asking young people to pursue careers they have no love for, it really asks them which problems they want to solve. And I found what that problem was for me as a student lobbyist at COP21, so the global meeting on climate in 2015. And it was my first time being in the actual system, being where decisions were being made, and my first time kind of aware of the bureaucracy and aware of the vested interests, aware of the greenwashing. I went to a sustainable innovation forum sponsored by Coca-Cola and BMW. And so I had this incredible cognitive dissonance and also this great feeling for the first time of powerlessness. And that really sparked my fascination with why we shut down in the face of these challenges, in the face of the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, also issues of social injustice that we deem too big and too overwhelming to fix, and how mindset is actually the most underutilized but most powerful tool that we have in igniting grassroots movements and also of creating change at that system level across policy and across business.
And I'm sure we'll dig a lot into that through this session. So you're all working on your own sort of individual pieces of work, incredible pieces of work. Clover, you've got Force of Nature, and we'll come to hear about that in just a minute. But Zamzam, you actually just started working on Green New Deal. Tell us a little bit about that, and also tell us about the UK climate strikers drafting a bill.
Yeah, so I recently just started on Green New Deal, and actually like the work that I'm doing with them is like probably more relevant than ever before. Like as we find out, like this is happening online because like we find ourselves in a pandemic that has completely changed the way in which we see like everyday life and like everything that we do. And for me, I think one of the most important things to highlight like that we're currently going through is that like is for us to be able to build hope for the concept of like being able to build back better, a better and a more resilient and stronger society. I think the failures that we've seen across essentially like across from like health all the way to like the economy has been like just systems that have already been broken, systems that have already been that were already set up to fail, that have just been exacerbated by this pandemic. And so like a pivotal part of like the role and the work that I'm doing with Green New Deal is about like actually calling for the recovery budget to be resilient, to actually like recognize the issues and get ahead of the problem. Because the reality is like we're going to need mass investment. We're going to need to rethink systems and structures to be able to be a coherent and resilient Britain that like we'd like to be. And so like there's a lot of work around that, and I think like for me like it's exciting because it's like work that's more relevant and more important than ever before. Like all of us know, like people listen to this, like have like all of us know somebody that's been impacted by this pandemic, either through like getting sick or like losing their job. Like the unemployment numbers are looking like they're gonna be like they're gonna hit around 2.5 million people by the end of by like before Christmas. And I think that's terrifying when you think about like that's absolutely terrifying. And so like there's to me like it's working like what I guess like it kind of relates to like what both of you said before, like a lot of the work that we do as activists like comes from like us like actually wanting to transform the world in which we live in, because we have hope and we believe that like things can be better, right? And so like we spend every minute and every second of our lives trying to fight for that, and trying to give that vision, right, regardless of like the way in which we do it. And for me like a big part of like the work, especially in the environmental justice movement, has been like there's a huge percentage of people that have just been left behind in this conversation, simply because we haven't been afforded like the political education to understand and to be able to navigate through these spaces. And so for me like when like for me being involved in these campaigns and like even like the work that we do like in Teach the Future, so like last year I had the opportunity to, and I'm thinking like, was it last year? I feel like this last couple of months have been such a blur. But I had the incredible opportunity as the national president to work with the climate strikers and to find like the Teach the Future campaign. And first of all, like it was like incredibly empowering for me, who has like been in those like spaces where I've worked with like essentially establishment like years and years, and like I get invited to like loads of establishment spaces that like it was like it was quite empowering for me to be in those spaces with young people who could like reimagine our education system beyond like the structures and like what we've been taught to reimagine it in. Because I think I realized then that I've become institutionalized even in my radical role, because I'm constantly in those spaces having those conversations with like elitists or like essentially like these academics that have been like doing this work for years, and like to be able to like rethink actually like what does a radical like rethink of our education system looks like. Because for me like one of the things that have always been pivotal to me is that like education is like the answer. Like we can't change the way in which we think. Like we can't change the way in which our leaders think if we don't start our education. The reality is like the kids that are going through primary school and high school right now are going to be our leaders, whether it's in our leaders in energy and health, in political office. Like they're going to be the ones that making those decisions, right? And so for me, I think like that's where we start, and that's why it's so pivotal.
I love that. And also what I love about what you've just talked about is we have in this conversation, the example of Clover, who did go through quite a radically different education system and is now an activist as a result of that. So I think we kind of have the proof that reimagining the education system can definitely make a huge difference. And I'm sure that everyone who's gone through that system has emerged probably doing things that they would have been quite different to had they gone through, the regular quote unquote institutions. Zakiya, I'm going to come to you because you created Swap It Up, and you're still in school. I think a lot of people are at college. People might not, you're all sort of still living life and trying to, figure things out. But you've done this at the same time. Tell us about Swap It Up.
Yeah, so I started Swap It Up 2 years ago when I was 15. So I was in year 11 at the time and balancing GCSEs at the same time as trying to set up this clothing exchange is what Swap It Up is. And essentially it's to promote the education behind the issues of fast fashion, both on the environment and also socially. And so the idea of it wasn't just to educate young people on this impact, but it was also to give them a platform on which to actually make change in their lives in a really easy and affordable way, because all they had to do was bring in clothes which would then be swapped for tokens, and then you could swap those tokens in exchange for other clothes brought into the swaps. And that meant that, for example, if you brought in a t-shirt, you would get 2 tokens, whereas a coat would be worth maybe 10 tokens. And so it meant if you brought in a coat, you could bring it in, you could buy 5 t-shirts, and sort of having that difference of that's how much you probably pay for it in a shop. And so the idea behind it was to recognize that value that clothes hold, but to also make people think more about it. And those clothes tend to be the clothes that you lost at the back of your wardrobe because you no longer wear them for whatever reason. You don't like the style anymore, or just doesn't fit you. And especially with young people who are constantly just growing and changing both their style and in terms of size, it just meant that young people could experiment with fashion and with style without having to think about how they are negatively impacting the environment and also our culture socially. And it just provided that platform for people to make those small steps in order for people to then develop those into larger actions. And I always kind of say those small steps, if everyone does it, it creates a big impact. And also you have to remember that if you're starting with these small steps, that doesn't necessarily mean that you end with those small steps. It's a small step and then you add on another small step, and you just continually grow and learn new ways to change your life to just benefit the environment. And obviously COVID has kind of been a bit of a bump in the road because it's a little bit difficult to swap clothes when you've got social distancing in place. So we've had to just figure out how we're going to come back from that. And at the moment, we're kind of more so using social media to develop our educational side from that perspective. And we can reach a much larger audience using social media than just through the schools, because it's not just educating young people, it's also educating parents and teachers and pretty much anyone on those social platforms. And as well as teaching people about fast fashion and the implications that has, it's also talking about other environmental issues as well, and also suggesting different ways that you can sort of adapt your life to be more suitable. And we tend to very much so look more towards the accessible side of things. So in terms of sustainable fashion, a lot of people will turn their back to that because suddenly that sounds really expensive, because a lot of these brands are suddenly really expensive. And although they're great for the environment, or a lot better than other companies, it's just not accessible to enough people. And so at least by selling your clothes, it's literally for free. So it is just so kind to the planet and to your purse. And honestly, it was an amazing idea, and I'm so glad I thought of it. And I'm hoping that we're going to be able to continue the swaps in some way, coming back from COVID. And I'm hoping that.
I mean, I hope you do. I hope you do as well, because I would like to swap some clothes. So sign me up. And I think thank you for that, Zakiya. And I think what's interesting, what both Zamzam and you have said, is that you've spoken quite a lot about the need for education of like the everyday person, and how often we think things might not be relevant to us, or we think that things aren't within our control because we just don't know how much we can do. And I know, Clover, this is something that you also look at. And so tell us a little bit about force of nature and this idea of tackling the concept of eco-anxiety.
Yeah, so when I left green school, when I left the bamboo bubble, I started working with business leaders. And the thing that really astonished me was that I kept hearing the same stories on repeat. I kept hearing from business leaders, well, it's not actually up to us to fix the problems, or, the system is too broken, or, I'm not smart enough, I'm not experienced enough. And funnily enough, I then started working in classrooms, volunteering in schools across the UK, and I would hear the same stories echoed there as well. So when I first started researching the psychology of inaction and this thing called ecophobia, so the feeling of powerlessness in the face of climate change, I began to realize just how universal this was by way of the stories that I kept hearing on repeat. But they manifested in different ways. So right now, there is an epidemic in mental health problems in young people. There was research that came out last year that over 75% of young people in the UK identify as having eco-anxiety, which relates to feelings of fear and stress and angst about the state of climate change. And it's also very prevalent in those spaces of power and in leaders as well. It just shows up in a different way. And so, eco-anxiety is a perfectly natural kind of human response to the issues. But when we don't have a clear sense of what it is that we can actually do, then that's when it tips into that ecophobia, that feeling of powerlessness. And it kind of manifests in two different ways in young people and in the adults that I've worked with. So in young people at the extreme end, it manifests into a real kind of nihilism and a real sort of dystopia. So young people saying it's too late, the system's too broken, and we're screwed, basically. And then on the other end of that, with a lot of leaders, their eco-anxiety, when it manifests into powerlessness, kind of turns into different forms of denial. And not denial in the sense of climate change isn't real, but, oh, well, it's not actually that bad. And the scientists are kind of, waxing lyrical about how bad it could be, or this weird kind of techno-utopia of, oh, but technology in Silicon Valley will fix all of the problems, even though the climate crisis is as much a symptom of broken social contracts. As Zemzem was saying, the climate crisis itself is the symptom of broken systems, from the clothes that I wear to the food in my fridge to, how we for centuries have exploited certain communities, namely communities of color, women, indigenous custodians of the land. And so we're not going to be able to deliver climate solutions at that system level until we acknowledge the history from which we come, and until we acknowledge the actual engine that's driving this, which is one of capitalism based on limitless growth with finite resources. And I'm sure we'll dive into that in a second. And we believe that at Force of Nature, that the most powerful tool that we do have is this one of mindset. And so we are an organization run by young people, a bit like Teach the Future. And we kind of address this problem of powerlessness two ways. So we work with young people around the world, from Guadalajara through Tel Aviv, through New York City, to shift from that eco-anxiety to real agency of what problem within this big, messy challenge can I take on, and what unique skills do I bring to the table, which are often kind of ignored through the standardized education system. And then we also work with business leaders and politicians, people in existing positions of power, as a forum for that intergenerational exchange. Because it's really interesting what you were saying, Zimzim, about almost feeling like you were then beholden to that system once you've been working in it for a while. And I feel the same way whenever I work with young people, is when given license to imagine a better future, they bring such energy and enthusiasm and kind of breakthrough ideas that are very difficult to emerge with if you've kind of been embedded in that system for a long time and subscribe to the status quo. So we really like to shake things up by kind of bringing together the energy of youth with the knowledge of experience.
Oh, I love this. Also, it reminds me of something that Zakiya was saying just before around like young people having creative ideas, because, if you sit outside the system, that's pretty much all you have, right? Okay, I have so many thoughts, but we don't have all the time, and this isn't about me. So I'm going to come to you, Zamzam, because one of the things that you've mentioned, and I'd like to get the thoughts of everyone else in the room as well, is around this idea of climate justice. And I personally am really interested in the idea of justice and what justice. around what I'm just going to pick up on that, around what justice looks like and whether richer countries should be essentially taking on more of the challenge and doing more. I mean, what does climate justice mean for you?
Okay. I mean, for me, like, climate justice is rooted in social justice. Like, it addresses the concerns for racism, for sexism, for like classism, right? Those, to me, like, embedded in all of those issues. And it recognizes that, like, it recognizes essentially it highlights and recognizes where the issues, who holds the power and causes the problems, and then who ultimately pays the price. And like earlier when I said like I was a skeptic, and like what I meant by that was that, like, for me, the most immediate issue that I faced and that I saw my community face as a Black woman growing up in like a working class area was essentially like directly I faced racism, right? And so like I was like, I don't care about the trees if like I'm being called the N-word when I go to school, my hijab is being pulled off when I'm on the train. Like, don't talk to me about like saving a few trees or like save the pandas. You don't care about Black lives. And for me, like, that anger like lived in me for so long. And so so for me, like, when it finally like made sense and it essentially connected, I realized where the problems lie, right? And like, sorry, am I
pause you there real quick? No. I'm just going to ask you to connect that for me, because that's something that I have definitely said. You know, like, why should I care about the trees when people don't care about Black lives? So how did you make that jump? You said you've made that jump. Tell me, like, what is that really boiled down?
For me, like, I think when it was simplified down to me, it was like understanding that, like, so actually, like, the great example that I like to use and like when I'm doing these training sessions are like understanding like how environmental racism has impacted like here in the UK. So for example, like London City Airport, which is probably an airport that like many of us don't use because it is like a private airport, more or less, was built in essentially an area that was 85% people of color, a Black community, and there was called the community there didn't essentially want any, like, didn't want that expansion. It wasn't something that was going to be used by that community, and the average, I think there were, I might be getting these stats wrong, but I think around the average pay in that within that community was around 35k, and the average user of that airport to use that airport was about 150k. So you can like understand the disparities of like actually like this is something that isn't going to be needed by that community. It isn't going to be used by that community. But it was built in that area because those people's lives were seen as disposable. The reality is that, like, when you build an airport in close proximity to a community, that directly impacts their living, right? And so actually, like, over years, we've seen they're living my English is completely going. I speak
the quality of life.
The quality of life has diminished by 20% over since it's been built, and so actually, like, and that is directly environmental racism. It's picking and choosing whose life is worth more than another, right? And for me, like, when I understood that, and like, and it was the action that Black Lives Matter did, when there was a call for the expansion of the airport, and they did a direct campaign. Actually, Black Lives Matter was born off that particular action. In the UK, but like it was that when I finally understood, like, actually, like, those impacts and actually what's happening back home. Like, I'm from Somalia, and Somalia has faced mass droughts over the years, and understanding that, like, actually those are not impacts that's being caused by Somalia, but they're paying the price for it. For me, like, those are the links that made sense. It was like, whoa, wait a minute, my family's paying the price. Like, we've lost land, we've lost crops, we've lost the ability to sustain ourselves and live. Like, of course there is a mass migration because they were having to move out of those areas because they were being like, the lands are being destroyed. And so for me, like, I then understood like where I stand in like being able to raise this, right? But also like understanding the pivotal part of like changing the way we speak about climate justice, and like moving away from like this, like essentially like the lip service, and moving away from the frameworks that just don't include people of color. Because the reality is, like, I have been in like these spaces, in these sectors where I've like been so frustrated and so angry. Like, we're literally in Black History Month, and like I have been asked to speak in so many different platforms about like climate justice, but I know full well like half of these organizations that are asking me are just going to be like, oh, isn't it great to have a black face as a part of our panel, but like aren't going to implement any of the issues that we highlight in their organizations. And for me, like, I think like as long as I can, and as long as I can bring like other people with me, like it's about like shaking those organizations, and like for them to understand the role that they play in changing their language, in changing their education. And for me, like, the only place that I have hope is like in young people. Like I feel like it's the only way that we can bring about that systematic change, by like bringing together a collective action, and like and bringing that journey of like those young people who are exactly like me, who like probably growing up right now and couldn't care less about like the polar bears and the trees, because that's just not their reality. That's just not something they understand.
Thank you so much for that. And what I also want to sort of talk personally and be like, when Selfridges and Intelligence Squared asked me to moderate this panel, I was like, oh, okay, interesting, climate justice. And then I was like, oh, there's a hijabi Somali British girl. That's somebody who's like me. And even though I'm 29, I think I still look around at the climate conversations and look for people who I think reflect the experiences and the perspective. So I just want to say thanks for sharing that. And then also come to you, Clover, because I think something that Zamzam just pointed to was really interesting, this idea that a lot of companies will pay lip service, and you mentioned Coca-Cola and all these other organizations who will sponsor things and maybe not really change what's going on. I mean, talk to me about how you think about the relationship between big business and climate justice. I mean, do we need a whole new economic system? What are we talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I know everything that Zamzam was just saying really, really resonated and was resonant with the experience of working with business leaders today and existing in the sustainability space. I think for the longest time, we've allowed the climate crisis to be communicated through the lens of polar bears and solar panels, when in fact, social justice is rooted in climate justice, exactly as you said. And we've allowed it to be really exclusionary. And that was something that I had to reflect on personally in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, to think about where I had failed to take a much more kind of intersectional, inclusive approach. And I saw that in the work that I did last year in schools across the UK. I had this one moment working with a group of students in Bristol, and I was giving the usual kind of climate spiel, and there was a group of girls in the back corner who were chatting away the entire time. And so I was like, okay, clearly they find this the most dull thing I've ever heard. And so I went over and chatted with them, and I was like, how is this landing for you? And deadpan, they said to me, how do you expect us to care about climate change when every day we experience racial discrimination, sexism, religious discrimination? And a number of them told me very candidly about their lived experience immigrating to the UK, the barriers they experienced day in, day out that were so far removed from my own lived experience and my bubble of privilege that I hadn't even stopped to consider that a message around this still nebulous existential threat of climate change would not at all speak to the reality that they faced every single day. And so I take it as a great responsibility and an urgent need within the space to be entirely inclusive. And the reality is the solutions reflect that, right? Like, if we look at Project Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, in the top 10 list of solutions is educating girls and providing women their reproductive rights. And yet, how often do you hear that message? How often do you hear the message of how can we actually lift people's lives up so that we all have equal access to opportunity, so that we all can lead lives of respect and dignity? And so I would start by saying that I'm really glad that we're talking about this because it's so often excluded from the conversation. And how this reflects in terms of business leaders, I think as Zemzem, you were saying, businesses are super quick to kind of jump to the gun and say, well, we've posted the black box on Instagram and we have the super diverse kind of color palette of faces in our latest ad campaign. And yet none of that diversity is actually reflected in our hiring process or the talent of our organization, or even of the rights that we extend to the people in our supply chain who are creating our products and services. And you see the same thing with greenwashing as well. There are plenty of companies that are super quick to say, well, yeah, we have all of the right labels and, we've made these super audacious commitments that are so far into the future that they require no immediate change. And a lot of companies want to continue to have conversations around sustainability and why it's the right thing to do without confronting the elephant in the room, which is that so long as we prioritize a single bottom line, so long as we prioritize profit over people and the planet, we will not deliver climate solutions fast enough and we will not avoid climate tipping points. And it's very difficult because the very bedrock of companies, for-profit companies, of an LLC is based on being beholden to your shareholders rather than your stakeholders. And we're starting to see a shift in that paradigm with the B Corp movement, for example, where companies are actually saying our number one imperative is to deliver on the needs of people and the planet as well. And so those are some kind of tricky conversations because a lot of companies and the leaders within them, I think they believe that they're doing the right thing, and yet so often are kind of drunk on their own green Kool-Aid that they are unable to see that there is no hope in another 10 years of incremental change. And in fact, it is unjust to equate an individual's contribution to climate change with the business leader or the politician whose decision equates many millions of individuals. And so we can, as much as we encourage people to buy, reusable coffee cups and turn off the lights when they leave a room. I think those things are great from a values perspective to reinforce the things that you care about. But the reality is we're not going to deliver these solutions through mass behavior change. The change has to happen at that system level in terms of how businesses create value and in terms of the policies and regulations that we're actually putting in place today.
Solid call to action. Yes, we love to hear it. And if you're a business leader listening, you heard it here first, as it were. We have a few minutes left before I'm going to turn to questions. And so if you have questions for any of our incredible activists, please, please, please type them in the chat box. Zakiya, I'm going to come to you because we've been talking big systemic policy changes, society level systemic changes. Swap It Up, though, has come from you as somebody in school seeing a problem and doing something about it. And I think there's something really incredible in individual action as well. So talk to me about how you heard that we have 12 years left to save the planet, and rather than collapsing into a puddle of despair, you decided to do something about that. And how do you encourage the people around you to do that as well?
So I'm not going to lie to you, at first when that report did come out, I did kind of collapse into a puddle of despair. But then I got myself up and was like, okay, thinking about this, thinking it through, what can I actually do about it? There's very little in terms of systemic change that I personally can do, but I can start to contribute to that. And so whilst we do need this systemic change from a government level and from sort of a corporation level, I do believe that isn't necessarily going to come as quickly if there isn't enough public pressure for that to happen. Because at the moment there is that cycle of these companies are doing what makes money, and if they suddenly see a drop in their profits, then they're going to have to realize that they need to do something to change. And so one of those things is through the example of fast fashion. If suddenly people are swapping their clothes and only buying pre-loved clothes, then suddenly these companies are going to go, okay, there's a reason for this happening. We're seeing a reduction in our profits. We're seeing a reduction in our sales. Why is this happening? And then looking at, okay, so this is what people are doing instead, and therefore we need to make these changes. So whether it's turning their factories to be completely like a net zero factory and only using renewable energy, but also making sure that there's no social implications, so they treat their workers fairly, because that is another thing that people are going to start to be asking for from these fast fashion houses after especially the Rana Plaza collapse, where so many people died because the building codes just weren't up to scratch. And so people are going to start to change their consumer behaviors because they're seeing that there is this inequality. And whilst as one person you don't necessarily have that power, you can't necessarily expect the world to change if you don't specifically do something yourself. You can't expect other people to do it if you don't want to do it. And so instead of just making sure that I go and buy pre-loved clothes and make sure my wardrobe is full of pre-loved clothes instead of just new clothes, I've set up something that allows other people to do the same. So I'm not saying that everyone has to go out and create these projects, but to find where these projects are happening so that they can contribute to them. And I agree with Clover completely that consumer behaviour and public change isn't going to be the thing that drives it. It is ultimately going to be what the companies do, what the governments implement from a systemic point of view. But in order to get that push, we need public opinions to change, and we need public pressures to change in order for that to happen. But again, from another point of view, is that the inaccessibility of that as well. And a lot of what I've seen within sort of environmentalism is that people have been blocked out of calling themselves an environmental activist for reasons such as not being vegan because they can't afford it. And for example, I'm not for a medical reason. And there's just so many things that you need to consider as to why someone can't necessarily make those changes. So whilst I am campaigning for people to make those changes, I am also at the same time I'm understanding where people can't necessarily, and you don't have to expect someone to give you an answer as to why they can't, because it can be quite a personal issue to them. So there is that sort of balance between making those changes where you can, but also not expecting everyone to do everything. And also, if you are in a position to make those changes, you should try to, not just for yourself and not just for the greater like humanity and everything, but also because perhaps your neighbour can't. And so not just doing it to change your life, but to also reduce their carbon footprint because they're not necessarily in a position to do that.
What a compassionate way of putting it. Thank you, Zakiya. And Zamzam, you looked like you wanted to add something. Did you want to add something?
I absolutely agree. And I think it's so important to just normalize like reusing clothes and sharing clothes. I think for me, I grew up, and because of my upbringing, just knowing that that cool jacket that my brother has is gonna be mine at some point, and it's just the way I grew up, and in our upbringing, it was just normalized to share clothes and to recycle and swap stuff, and that's always been normal. And I think that's something that's so important to I think for a lot of the work that I do, especially in working class communities, I think our economic situations made us by force be sustainable in that way, whether it was mum using the butter pan to put food in and leave that in the fridge, or the sweet tin always having something else in it, not sweets, but that was normalized growing up. And I think you get to a point in life where you move out of that economic bubble and you think that you need to change your way of living, and you need more and more things. And I think that just comes from societal expectations. It comes from social media. It comes from and so that societal change and normalizing that is so incredibly important, because as yes, environmentalism, for us to get into a space where we achieve like a economic model and a judicial model and a societal model that works for all of us, like you're gonna have to change behaviors. You're gonna have to, for everybody to understand and be a part of that journey. Because the reality is that right now it's like the 90% that are struggling and the 1% that are living their best lives. And like you can't change those behaviors until like the 90% understand where the problems lie. And so that's why I'm always like this is a collective journey. Like this is something that we need to present and like bring everybody on along on.
Oh, this is a collective journey. Amazing. So thank you all for sending in questions. Please continue to send your questions. We've got some great ones coming through. The Sustainability Sisters ask, in one sentence, if you could say something to the people who don't really care for climate justice / the environment, what would it be? In one sentence. Clover, what would you say?
Why do I have to go first?
I'm just going to put you on the spot. Sorry.
You know what? Well, I'm gonna challenge the question, because I think there is a really dominant narrative that people don't care, and I think the reality is a lot of people don't feel empowered to care. And in fact, I think part of the shutdown that happens in the face of these problems is because we care so much, whether we don't have a sense of what we can do or how we can actually create change, that we disallow those feelings or we kind of try to suppress them. So I would say that, in fact, it's not about getting people to care. It's allowing them to sit in those feelings, sit in the anxiety and grief and overwhelm, and then become empowered agents of change.
Oh, okay. I mean, Zamzam, Zakiya, can you add anything to that? I mean,
I feel like
out of the park.
I'm out.
Yeah. She's like, empower them to care. I was like, ooh, okay. Right. So we're just going to get to the next question. General question to everybody. What's the role of creative professionals in bringing climate awareness to the public? Do you know any creative project focusing on raising awareness? Does anyone want to take that? It's an interesting, I think maybe anything creative, whether it's art or maybe television, film, sculpture.
Yeah. I'm happy to dive in quickly. I think that part of a lot of young people we work with feel like they're almost like faceless activists in the movement, because they might not want a banner blaze in the street, or they might not see a clear kind of path for engagement. And I would say that actually, as diverse as the problems are, so too are the solutions and the talents that are needed to show up and solve these challenges. And art is one of the greatest catalysts that we have in society to create cultural movements and to actually change the way that we think about things and change the way that we see the world. And a lot of the young people we work with currently feel incredibly disenfranchised. And when asked about the future, this 8 and 9-year-olds in the classroom are describing something out of a dystopian blockbuster of cities being underwater, of disease, being rampant, and of a planet in decline. And I feel that what we're really lacking at this moment in time is the vision of a better, brighter future. And I'd love Zemzem to speak more to the kind of Green New Deal, because I think it's what gives me the most hope, because it's like a flavor of what that actually could look like. And so I think artists are absolutely critical, and people in the creative industry, to be able to actually illustrate what it is we need to work toward and make that exciting and sexy so that people kind of rally behind it.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree with you. And I think, I think the issue is it's often something that people just can't imagine. Like, we struggle to imagine anything being different, right? And so in the same way, I guess like several years ago when phones didn't exist, and you told somebody everybody's gonna have an iPhone in a couple of years, and be like, absolutely bloody not. And I think a lot of reimagining is trying to unlearn what we've been told is impossible, and understanding it as possible. And for me, one of the exciting things that are happening more and more is some of that really local work of locally people coming together and just reimagining their community, understanding what a transformed and Green New Deal can do to their local community. Like, what does that look like in terms of their schools? What does that look like in terms of like their local business? What does that look like, you know, for like the youth center that closed down 10 years ago that they've never had access to, you know? Like, how does that look like in terms of like play space for like young people, you know? And like understanding like actually that it's like a Green New Deal is the solution to like the economical and issues that are like existing and have been exacerbated by many different factors. There are many different things that have come along. But for me, like one of the most exciting things have been like just like hearing locally about like how a Green New Deal can completely transform a community and people reimagining their own community, right? Like and so like there's there have been like visioning events and like where like young people and like as long like for me like one of the cool things is like when you have people who've lived in a certain area for years come together and tell you like a couple of years ago, like 30-40 years ago when I was working here, like this used to be here and that used to be here, and like these young people being like, wait, what? Like how was that there? Like what happened to that? And then them coming together and being like, actually, how is this possible? Like what can be possible? And for me, like that is so powerful, because when you take an issue that is so universal, it's global, like everyone's going through it, right? But then you apply it to like your everyday life, where it's like the local shop that you go to every day, where you went to school, and like, or like the park that you love, and you have some incredible memories with your friends, whether it's like hanging out after high school, or like actually the picnic that you had like just last Christmas. And so why would you have picnic in Christmas in a park?
Listen, yeah. The weather gods is doing all. I'm gonna jump in there.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. I think those are like just incredibly important for me, like just localizing some of that work, and especially the role that small businesses have in doing that.
Zakiya, did you have something to add on the creative thing as well? It looked like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say that some creative minds are possibly some of the most important minds to kind of have in reimagining our future, because they're the ones that are going to, like Clover and Zamzam were saying, are going to see what we've got now and not expect the future to look the same, and are going to reimagine what it's going to look like. And so not necessarily the ones that are going to develop the things to put in place, but they will be the ones that design them. And so that going forward is going to be fundamental in making sure that our future is as sustainable as possible, and understanding how those minds can be used in terms of designing new ways for renewable energy to be used, for, like Zamzam was saying, local projects such as perhaps landscaping projects for community gardens, and how these things can be implemented on both a local scale but then also on a wider, more global scale as well.
And what I'm hearing from all three of you is this idea that we need everybody to be part of this. This isn't just for one type of person, for one type of profession, but all of us have some role to play. And that kind of leads me to something that a lot of people have been asking in lots of different ways, which is, what do we do? And I know that this isn't, like how to fix the world 101, but what kind of action do you give, or would you, like, you have the platform right now, an audience of people that are listening, what are you really urging them to like lead this call and perhaps do differently?
I would say to just be a bit more mindful of what we're doing, just to reflect on things. So maybe you are going to buy something and it's not necessarily the most environmentally sustainable thing for you to buy, but to be aware of what your actions are and how they might have an impact. And then noticing perhaps where those could change in the future. And so I would say for everyone to kind of just, as they're doing something, to just reflect on what they are doing. And I understand we're all leading such busy lives that it can be quite hard to take this moment to reflect. But it will also help on that sort of mental health aspect, that you are taking a moment to not just reflect on this action, but you're also taking a moment to just take a breath and just understand where you are in this moment and where you can be in the next day or the next couple of years, and just kind of take it from there?
I mean, for me, I think like the way I see it is that like if you are not doing anything, then you are a part of the problem. And I think like inaction is probably the most like the worst possible thing you can do. And so like for me, it's important first of all to understand where we hold power. That's the only way we can understand like actually like what input and what influence we can have. And so like if you are a individual who holds power locally or even nationally, then like what you do to challenge the conversations and to influence some of the conversations on that. If you're a person that holds wealth, for example, like are you supporting local organizations that are doing that work, or are you essentially like just a part of that problem? And I think there's some difficult conversations that I really need to have with a lot of different different sectors and a lot of people, and it's an uncomfortable conversation, right? Because like I think like understanding that we might be a part of a problem of something that like we don't like nobody I mean with the exception of a few people, I don't think anyone's necessarily bad. And I think like I think we're all socialized in a certain way, but also like I think it is almost like British culture to just like to shy away from like admitting our truth sometimes. And I think like we need to be uncomfortable to understand like I need to shift a little bit to the left and like actually check my privilege and make changes, whether that's national, local, or like even like incremental changes in ourselves and our behaviors and the way in which we do. But I think everybody holds power. I think one of the things that like my father taught me from a very young age, through a very weird and unconventional way. So like when I was young, my father made me tutor other people's kids and he paid me. And I found it weird. I was like, why are you paying me to tutor other people's kids? You're my dad. Like I want pocket money. And like and at the time it was young Somalis who were coming over from Somalia and who were refugees and therefore like weren't essentially like couldn't afford to learn to get like tutors. And so my dad was teaching me a lesson. He was teaching me like at the age of 11, I held the power through education to change somebody else's life, to completely transform somebody else's life. And like for me, that's an important and pivotal lesson that I've held all these years. And so understanding that like actually like every single one of us, even like the 11-year-olds that are sat like around playing games right now, hold power because we all hold the power to transform people's lives, and then understanding like how we do that and actually just doing it.
That's
leaning
such
into
a
our power.
powerful story that it really gave me goosebumps, and I think it leads really well on to what we try to achieve within Force of Nature. If we respond to this idea that the greatest threat that we face isn't in fact climate change, but the feeling of powerlessness in the face of it, then what we really try to do within individuals is ignite that sense of agency by finding your power. And we do that in a pretty simple way, to be honest. So if you can think of it as a kind of Venn diagram, in one circle, you have the problem that you want to solve. And in the other circle, you have your passion. And at the junction, you have your power. Now, why one problem? One of the greatest sources of overwhelm is that we care about so many of the issues, right? You go on Instagram and you're like, oh, there are 20 things for me to care about today and give energy to. And in fact, any change maker in history would tell us that to be effective, you have to have focus. You have to say, this is the thing that ignites a fire in my belly. This is where I want to have legacy, and this is the problem I want to solve. And so find what that problem is for you. Find that thing that you could spend, hours talking to your friend about or like debating on. And then when it comes to passion, often through the standardized education system, we are neglected the opportunity to actually discover where we're smartest because we don't fit into a very rigid mold. So think about what comes to you as easily as breathing, what gives you energy, what ignites your passion and your excitement, and think about how you can show up to solve that problem using that series of skill sets. And when you do both of those things, you find your power. And that has to be led by a bigger why, and only by meeting the anger that you might have about that problem with the passion that you have for solving it, are you going to be able to actually sustain your activism so that you don't burn out?
Folks, take a moment to reflect, lean into your power, ignite your passion. This has been the most inspiring, genuinely, session. Thank you so much, Clover Hogan, Zakiya Kadjie, Zamzam Ibrahim. This has been the Climate Change Makers by Selfridges Project Earth and Intelligence Squared. Have a gorgeous evening and good luck out there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.